What's something your family did growing up that you didn't realize was against the law? Dad would wake us up super early on random Saturday mornings and be like, "Adventure Day!" And we'd all pile into our old blue van that Mom called the Mystery Machine. Yes, Scooby-Doo reference, LOL. We'd drive for hours sometimes, usually to different cities or towns within a few hours of home. The thing about these adventure days is that they always involved exploring what Dad called forgotten places. Basically abandoned buildings, old factories, closed down hospitals, unfinished construction sites, stuff like that. Dad would pack these little backpacks for each of us with flashlights, gloves, water bottles, and snacks. We'd park a few blocks away and then walk to these places, usually through some back entrance or broken fence. I always thought this was just normal family fun. Like, I literally had no idea other families didn't do this. I remember bragging about it in elementary school and my teacher giving me this weird look, but I didn't think anything of it. Dad had these rules we had to follow. No posting pics on social media, which seemed normal, privacy, whatever. Always whisper inside buildings. If we saw anyone else, we'd use our code word, banana, and immediately leave. We could each take one small souvenir, but only if it was already broken or clearly abandoned. Never ever tell anyone specific locations of our adventures. My brother Finn was obsessed with these trips. He started a collection of little items, like a rusted sign from an old factory, a broken piece of decorative tile from an abandoned hotel, stuff like that. Mom would help him arrange them in these shadow boxes in his room. I wasn't as into collecting stuff, but I loved exploring and the adrenaline rush of being somewhere we shouldn't be. Then when I was about 14, I was at my friend Maria's house and her dad was a police officer. We were talking about weekend plans and I mentioned, without specific details, that my family might go exploring. Maria's dad started asking questions, and I described how we'd find cool abandoned places to check out. Y'all, the look on this man's face? He very carefully asked me if we had permission to enter these buildings. I was like, no? They're abandoned? And he explained that what we were doing was actually breaking and entering plus trespassing, which are illegal crimes. I was shook. I literally had no idea. In my mind, if a place was abandoned, it was fair game. I asked if it was still illegal if we didn't break anything, and he was like, yes, very much so. Then he asked about the souvenirs and explained that was technically theft. I went home that day feeling so weird and confused. Like my whole childhood was built around this activity that was actually criminal, but my parents are the most normal, rule-following people otherwise. Dad works in accounting. Mom volunteers at church. We're not criminals. I tried to casually bring it up with my mom like, hey, so I was wondering about our adventures. And she got this weird look and changed the subject super fast. That's when I knew they knew it was illegal all along. A few months went by, and I started noticing that our adventure days were happening less frequently. Dad would make excuses about being busy with work. I figured they realized I knew the truth and were phasing it out. Then last month, Dad announced we were doing a special adventure night. Said he'd found this amazing abandoned mansion about 2 hours away that was perfect and completely safe. Finn was hyped, but I was hesitant. Still, I didn't want to be left out, so I went along. This place was different from our usual spots. It was this massive old mansion that looked like it had been abandoned mid-renovation. Tools everywhere, half-finished walls, but also some rooms that still had furniture and stuff. It felt less abandoned, more like someone was in the middle of working on it. I remember whispering to Finn that this didn't feel right, and he brushed me off. Dad seemed super excited about this place, kept pointing out architectural details and taking pictures, which he never did before. We were in this huge library room with built-in bookshelves when Finn found this small wooden box hidden behind some books. He opened it, and inside was a bunch of jewelry, like real jewelry with gems and gold. Not costume stuff. The look on Dad's face was intense. He told Finn to put it in his backpack right away. I was like, Dad, that's not like a little souvenir, that's someone's actual valuable stuff. And he got angry in a way I'd never seen before. That's when we heard a car pulling up outside. Dad peeked through the window and went completely pale. He grabbed Mom's arm and whispered something. She looked terrified and grabbed Finn while Dad grabbed me, and we ran to the back of the house. As we were rushing down this back staircase, I heard voices inside the house and realized this wasn't an abandoned building at all. This was someone's home that was being renovated. We weren't urban explorers. We were literally burglarizing a house. Dad was pulling me toward this back door when suddenly there was a flashlight beam and someone shouted, "Stop right there!" I turned and saw a security guard pointing at us. And then he reached for something on his belt and I heard a loud bang. Holy shit! I thought we were being shot at. Mom screamed and I literally pissed myself right there. The security guard had just slammed his flashlight against the wall to get our attention, but in that split second, I thought we were all gonna die. Dad immediately pushed me behind him and put his hands up, yelling, "Don't shoot! We're leaving! We have kids here!" The security guard was furious, shouting about calling the police. Mom was crying and Finn looked like he was gonna throw up. The security guard made us all sit on the floor while he called the police. The whole time, Dad kept saying, "This is all a misunderstanding," and we thought this place was abandoned. But the guard wasn't buying it. He kept pointing at our backpack, saying, "Then what's in there? What did you take?" Finn started crying and pulled out the jewelry box. The guard's eyes went wide, and he got on his radio again, saying, "You better get here fast. These people were stealing jewelry." I was sitting there, soaked in my own piss, watching my family fall apart. And all I could think was, this has been illegal the whole time. We've been criminals my entire childhood. When the police arrived, they separated us all for questioning. I was terrified and told them everything. All about our adventure days since I was little, all the places we'd been, the souvenirs we'd taken. The officer questioning me looked more and more disturbed as I talked. They took us all to the police station. I'd never seen my parents look so scared. Mom was sobbing. Dad kept trying to talk to us, but the officers wouldn't let him. They called my Aunt Patricia to come get me and Finn since our parents were being detained. When Aunt Patricia arrived, she looked at us like we were aliens. "What the hell is going on?" she kept asking, but we couldn't even explain it properly. How do you explain that your normal, church-going, tax-paying parents had been teaching you to commit crimes every weekend for your entire childhood? The ride to her house was silent, except for Finn having a complete breakdown in the back seat. I remember staring out the window thinking my life as I knew it was over. At Patricia's house, she made us shower and gave us clean clothes. Then she sat us down and said, "Your parents are in serious trouble. They're being charged with breaking and entering, attempted burglary, and child endangerment." Child endangerment. My parents. The same people who made me wear a helmet to ride a bike around our cul-de-sac, who checked my Halloween candy with a flashlight, who had a family emergency plan for natural disasters. I tried calling Maria to talk to her dad, thinking maybe he could help, but Patricia took my phone away, saying, "No calls until we figure this out." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all those adventure days, how excited we'd been, how special they felt. The matching backpacks Dad got us, the little treasure hunts Mom would create inside the buildings sometimes, the picnics we'd have afterward. All of it was illegal. All of it could have gotten us arrested or hurt or worse at any time. The next morning, Patricia got a call. She spoke in whispers, but I heard enough. Dad was being held on bond. Mom was being released to come get us. The jewelry we'd found was worth over $50,000. The house belonged to some rich family who'd been renovating it for months. When Mom finally arrived, she looked like a different person. Her eyes were red and hollow. She hugged us both so tight I couldn't breathe, then pulled back and said, "I need you both to listen carefully. What happened last night was a terrible mistake. The other adventures were different. They really were abandoned places. But Daddy made a very bad choice last night. I lost it. I started screaming at her. They were all illegal. Every single one. You knew it the whole time." I was shoving her, hitting her arms, completely out of control. "You made us into criminals. You lied to us our whole lives." Patricia had to physically pull me off Mom. Finn was frozen, just staring at us both like he didn't recognize either of us. Mom started crying again, saying, "You don't understand. It wasn't like that." But I didn't want to hear it. I ran to Patricia's guest room and barricaded the door with a chair. Hours later, Patricia convinced me to come out. She explained that Mom needed to take us home to get some clothes because we might need to stay with her for a while. The police would be coming to our house to talk to us again. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Nobody spoke. Inside, Mom sat us down at the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking as she told us, "Your father has a problem. He's always been attracted to places he shouldn't go. When we first met, it was just abandoned buildings, truly abandoned ones. But over time, he started taking things. Small things at first, then bigger things." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So we were burglars? This whole time?" "No!" Mom shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "Not you kids. Never you. The souvenirs were just to make it seem normal to you, like a family activity. Your father never wanted you to know what he was really doing." My entire childhood flashed before my eyes. All those times Dad would go off exploring on his own during our adventures. All those times we'd wait in a certain room while he checked other parts of the building for safety. Mom kept talking, her voice breaking. "I wanted to stop years ago, but your father, he said it was harmless. He said it made him feel alive, and the money helped when times were tough." "Money!" I screamed. "What money?" And that's when she told me the truth. Dad had been selling the valuable things he found in these places for years. Antique, copper wiring, historical artifacts, our family vacations, my dance lessons, Finn's private school, all paid for with stolen. I ran to the bathroom and threw up until there was nothing left. When I came back, Mom was on the phone with a lawyer. Finn was just sitting there, staring at his hands. I went to my room and started packing. I had no idea what was going to happen next, but I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The police arrived an hour later. 2 officers and a woman who introduced herself as from Child Protective Services. They wanted to interview me and Finn separately again. The CPS woman was gentle but direct. "Did you ever feel in danger during these adventures?" I didn't know how to answer. I never felt in danger from my parents. But were the buildings dangerous? Probably. Had I been one loose floorboard away from falling through a rotted floor my entire childhood? Apparently. Did you know what you were doing was wrong? She asked. No, I shouted. I swear I didn't know until a few months ago when Maria's dad told me. And even then, I thought it was just like a minor thing, not burglary. She wrote everything down, asked about other suspicious activities in our home, asked if Dad ever made me keep other secrets. It was horrible. They were treating him like some kind of monster. When they were done, the CPS woman told Mom that Finn and I could stay with her for now, but there would be follow-up visits and a court hearing to determine if we were at risk. First update. The morning after we were caught in that mansion, the police showed up at our house with a search warrant. I'm not talking about 1 or 2 officers. There were 5 police cars outside our house, and our neighbors were all just standing around watching like it was some kind of sick reality show. Mom tried to act calm, but her hands were shaking so bad she could barely unlock the front door. As they started searching, this detective sat us down in the kitchen and explained that Dad had been doing this for years, way longer than I realized. The adventure days were basically his cover for a much larger operation where he'd scope out places, determine if they had valuable items, and then come back later alone to take them. The detective kept asking us what we knew, and Mom kept insisting that Finn and I were completely innocent. But then the detective pointed to all of Finn's shadow boxes on his bedroom wall and asked, "And what about these?" Finn completely lost it. He started screaming that they were just souvenirs, just little broken things nobody wanted. When the detective started taking them down to bag as evidence, Finn literally lunged at him. Mom had to physically restrain him while he sobbed hysterically. I just stood there watching my brother have a complete breakdown over stolen property that he didn't even realize was stolen. The police started identifying items all over our house. That antique mirror, a grandfather clock in the dining room, even this old record player Dad gave me for my birthday last year. All of it was stolen. I couldn't even look at my own bedroom without wondering if everything in it was the result of some crime. Aunt Patricia came over during the search and practically dragged Mom into the backyard. I followed them because I needed to hear whatever they were going to say. Patricia was livid, like I've never seen her before. She got right in Mom's face and was like, "How could you let this happen? How could you drag those kids into this? What kind of mother are you?" And that's when Mom finally broke. She just collapsed onto the patio chair and told us everything. Apparently, Dad had always been into urban exploration even before they met. But it was just abandoned places then. After they got married and started struggling financially, Dad lost his job when I was about 4, he started taking small things to sell. Mom said she confronted him about it, but he convinced her it was harmless. Just items from truly abandoned places that no one cared about anymore. But it escalated. By the time I was 10, he was specifically targeting vacant properties that still had valuable items inside. The adventure days started as a way to normalize it for us kids, to make it seem like a fun family activity instead of, actual crime. Mom said she wanted to stop so many times, but by then they were dependent on the extra income. My dance lessons, Finn's soccer team, our family vacations, all paid for with stolen goods. I just stared at her, completely disgusted. "So, you're telling me that everything in our life is basically built on theft? That every happy memory I have is funded by crime?" Mom couldn't even look at me. Patricia put her arm around me, but I shoved her away. I didn't want comfort. I wanted the last 15 years of my life back. When the police finally left, they took boxes of stuff from our house. Mom wasn't arrested, but they said she needed to come in for more questioning. We couldn't stay at the house, it was still technically a crime scene, so Patricia took us back to her place. The next day at school was brutal. Word had already spread somehow, and everyone was staring at me and whispering. My friend Maria tried to act normal, but even she seemed uncomfortable. During lunch, this girl, Teresa, who I'd never even talked to before, came up to my table and was like, "Is it true your dad's a professional burglar? My mom says your whole house is filled with stolen stuff." I lost it. I slammed my hands on the table and screamed at her to mind her own damn business. The cafeteria went completely silent. I grabbed my backpack and stormed out, skipping the rest of my classes. I just walked around town for hours, looking at all the buildings and houses, and wondering if Dad had broken into any of them. When I finally went back to Patricia's, Mom was there waiting. She'd been released after questioning and was allowed to see us, but she couldn't take us home yet. She tried to hug me, but I couldn't even stand to be touched by her. Finn, on the other hand, ran straight into her arms sobbing about how they took all his collections. That night, Mom sat us down and told us that Dad's bail had been set. It was high, like ridiculously high, but they were trying to get it reduced. In the meantime, we needed to prepare ourselves for what was coming next. Dad was facing multiple felony charges. Our house might need to be sold to pay for legal fees and restitution. We might have to change schools. The Child Protective Services investigation was ongoing. I couldn't process any of it. I just kept thinking about how my entire childhood was a lie. Every time Dad had said, "I'm so proud of you," after a dance recital, was he thinking about how he'd stolen someone's heirloom to pay for my costume? Every Christmas morning, were we opening presents bought with money from someone else's belongings? The next day, Mom took us to see Dad in jail. I didn't want to go, but Patricia said I needed closure or whatever. The jail was nothing like in movies. It was this depressing, sterile place with fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. When Dad walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit, I literally didn't recognize him at first. He looked 10 years older. He tried to act normal, asking about school and if we were okay staying with Patricia. Mom kept the conversation light, but I couldn't play along. Finally, I just blurted out, "Why did you do it? Why did you make us part of it?" Dad's face changed. He leaned forward and said something I'll never forget. "I wanted to give you kids the kind of life I never had. When I was growing up, we had nothing. I swore my kids would have everything. And when I lost my job and couldn't provide, I found another way." I wanted to scream at him that I would have rather grown up poor than with a criminal for a father, but the words wouldn't come out. I just sat there, staring at this stranger in an orange jumpsuit, trying to reconcile him with the dad who taught me how to ride a bike and checked under my bed for monsters. Before our time was up, Dad looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I never wanted you kids to know. The souvenirs, the adventures, that was supposed to be the fun part. The rest of it." He trailed off, and for the first time, I saw real shame in his eyes. On the drive back to Patricia's, Finn asked Mom if we could get Dad's bail reduced if we returned all the souvenirs we'd collected over the years. Mom just started crying silently, which made Finn cry too. I stared out the window, feeling nothing but this hollow ache where my family used to be. When we got back, I overheard Patricia and Mom talking in the kitchen. Patricia was saying something about how the police had connected Dad to at least 7 other break-ins in 3 different counties. Mom kept repeating, "He said they were abandoned. He promised me they were abandoned." The next morning, I woke up to Finn rummaging through my backpack. When I caught him, he had this guilty look on his face. "What are you doing?" I demanded. He mumbled something about looking for his charger, but then I noticed something shiny in his hand. It was a small gold locket, one I'd never seen before. When I grabbed it from him, he broke down crying and admitted he'd taken it from Patricia's jewelry box. "It's just like the adventures," he sobbed. "I just wanted something normal again." That's when it hit me. Dad hadn't just stolen objects. He'd stolen our sense of right and wrong. Second update, Dad's court hearing was, and it went about as terribly as you might expect. We all had to dress up in our nice clothes, which felt ridiculous considering we were basically there to watch our family be torn apart. The courthouse was this cold, imposing building that made me feel like I was the one on trial. Mom kept nervously fixing Finn's collar and smoothing my hair like we were heading to church or something, not watching our father plead guilty to multiple felonies. The courtroom wasn't anything like on TV. It was smaller and way more intimidating. There were other families there for different cases, all looking as miserable as we felt. When they called Dad's case, my stomach dropped. He shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit with actual chains around his ankles. He looked so small and ordinary, not like someone who'd been systematically robbing houses for over a decade. The prosecutor listed out all the charges. Multiple counts of breaking and entering, burglary, theft, possession of stolen property, and, this one hit me hardest, contributing to the delinquency of minors. That's US. We're the minors he was contributing to the delinquency of. When the judge asked how he pled, Dad just said, "Guilty," in this dead voice I'd never heard before. His lawyer tried to make this whole speech about how Dad was just trying to provide for his family, how he'd lost his job and felt desperate, how he'd never been violent or hurt anyone. The judge just sat there with this stone-cold expression. Then she asked if any of the victims wanted to speak. I didn't even know there would be victims there. But this older couple stood up, the ones who owned the mansion we broke into. The woman was crying as she described coming home to find their family heirlooms missing, how violated they felt, how they couldn't sleep in their own home for weeks. The husband talked about how the jewelry box contained his mother's wedding ring and pieces he'd given his wife on special anniversaries that could never be replaced. I wanted to disappear into the floor. These weren't faceless, abandoned buildings. These were real people with real lives that my family had damaged. I looked over at Mom, who was staring straight ahead with tears streaming down her face. Finn was completely shut down, like he'd gone somewhere else in his head. When it was time for sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. 5 years for Dad, 5 years. Plus probation after that, and we'd have to pay back everything. Restitution, they called it. The list of stolen items they'd linked to Dad was worth over $200,000. $200,000. Where were we supposed to get that kind of money? After the hearing, we weren't allowed to talk to Dad. They just took him away. Mom collapsed into Aunt Patricia's arms in the hallway, sobbing about how we were going to survive. I stood there holding Finn's hand, feeling like my entire future had just evaporated. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and meetings. Our house was essentially being seized. Not technically, but we had to sell it to start paying the restitution. Mom met with this financial advisor who basically told her we were screwed. All of Dad's adventure money that had been supporting us needed to be paid back, and without his income, we couldn't afford our mortgage anyway. We had 2 weeks to move out, 2 weeks to pack up our entire lives. The worst part was sorting through everything, never knowing what was legitimately ours and what was stolen. Mom kept finding things, little decorative items, electronics, even some of my childhood toys that she suspected might have been taken from somewhere. We ended up leaving so much behind because we were afraid of accidentally taking more stolen property. School became actual hell. Word had fully spread about Dad, and suddenly I was the burglar's daughter. Most people just whispered behind my back, but this group of girls led by Teresa, the one who'd confronted me in the cafeteria, took it to another level. They started calling me Sticky Fingers and asking if I was going to steal their stuff. I tried ignoring them, but one day in the locker room after gym, Teresa took it too far. She noticed my silver bracelet, one Dad had given me for my 14th birthday, and loudly asked if I'd stolen it from someone's grandma. Something in me snapped. I shoved her so hard she fell back against the lockers. She came back at me swinging, and next thing I knew we were on the floor pulling each other's hair and screaming. It took 2 teachers to separate us. We both got suspended for 3 days. When Mom picked me up from the principal's office, I expected her to be furious. Instead, she just looked tired. In the car, she asked if the bracelet really was stolen. I stared out the window and asked how I was supposed to know what was real and what was a lie anymore. She didn't have an answer for that. The suspension actually came at a good time, if anything about this situation could be called good, because we were in the middle of packing up the house. We'd found this tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, all we could afford now. Mom had to cash out her retirement account just to cover the security deposit and first month's rent. Her hair has started going gray at the temples, and she looks about 10 years older than she did a month ago. The worst part was when the CPS caseworker showed up for her follow-up visit. She took one look at our half-packed house and started asking questions about our stability. Mom tried to explain that we were downsizing because of financial issues, but the caseworker kept making these notes in her file that made my stomach hurt. She asked to speak to me and Finn separately. When it was my turn, she asked if I felt safe with my mother. I was like, what kind of question is that? Of course I feel safe with her. But then she started digging into whether Mom knew about Dad's activities all along, whether she ever encouraged us to take things, whether she'd been an active participant. I defended Mom as best I could, but the truth was, I wasn't totally sure anymore. How could she not have known where all that extra money was coming from? After the caseworker left, Mom had a complete breakdown. She just sat on the floor surrounded by moving boxes and sobbed that they were going to take us away from her. I'd never seen her so terrified. I sat down next to her and put my arm around her shoulders, and we just stayed like that for a long time. For the first time, I saw her as a person, not just my mom, someone who'd made terrible mistakes but was drowning in the consequences. The moving day was chaotic and depressing. We had to rent this tiny moving truck and could only take what would fit in our new place. Aunt Patricia helped, but there was tension between her and Mom that hadn't been there before. I overheard Patricia telling Mom that she was still enabling Dad by acting like he was the only one responsible, that Mom needed to own her part in all this. Mom turned around and snapped that Patricia had always been jealous of their life, that she'd been happy to benefit from their nice house and family vacations without ever questioning where the money came from. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. She quietly said, "I never would have let my niece and nephew become accessories to crime," and walked out. She came back an hour later and kept helping, but they barely spoke after that. The new apartment is depressing. The walls are this dingy beige color, and you can hear the neighbors through the walls. Finn and I have to share a bedroom, which is awkward since I'm 15 and he's 14. We hung up a blanket to divide the room, but it doesn't help much. Mom sleeps on a pull-out couch in the living room because there's only 2 bedrooms. The kitchen is tiny, and the bathroom has this persistent mildew smell we can't get rid of. The first night, none of us could sleep. I could hear Mom crying quietly in the living room. Around midnight, I got up to get some water and found Finn sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. When I turned on the light, I saw he had a small collection of items spread out in front of him, little things I recognized from our old house, from Aunt Patricia's, even what looked like a fancy pen I'd never seen before. I completely lost it. I grabbed him by the shoulders and practically shouted in his face, asking what the hell he was doing if he wanted to end up like Dad. He started crying and saying he couldn't help it, that he felt this urge to take things, that Dad had taught him it was okay as long as you didn't get caught. I wanted to shake him, to make him understand how serious this was, but I realized that Finn had spent most of his formative years being taught that stealing was normal. Dad's rules and adventure days had rewired his brain. So instead of yelling more, I sat down and asked him where he'd gotten everything. Together, we made a plan to return each item. I told him whenever he felt the urge to take something, he needed to come to me first. It was a small moment of taking control in this chaos, but it felt important. For the first time, I was making a conscious choice to break the pattern Dad had created. The next big hurdle was starting at our new schools. Mom had to transfer us because we'd moved to a different district. My first day, I kept my head down and didn't talk to anyone. I was terrified someone would somehow know about Dad, but it seemed like the story hadn't traveled this far. I was just the new girl, which was its own kind of awful but better than being the burglar's daughter. Last weekend, Mom took us to visit Dad again. The jail was just as depressing as before, but Dad looked different, more defeated, less like he was just waiting to get out and go back to normal. When Mom stepped away to get water, Dad leaned forward and asked me if I was taking care of Finn and Mom. I wanted to scream at him that it wasn't my job to take care of everyone, that I was 15 and just trying to survive this nightmare he created. Instead, I asked him point blank if he ever felt guilty about the people he stole from. His answer shocked me. He said yes, all the time. That sometimes he'd lie awake at night thinking about the families whose memories he'd taken, but then he'd look at our family photos, at me and Finn growing up with everything we needed, and he'd convince himself it was worth it. I didn't know what to say to that. How do you respond when someone tells you they hurt others to give you a better life? That your dance recitals and soccer games and Christmas mornings came at the expense of other families' treasured possessions? On the drive home, Mom revealed another bombshell. She'd found a job as a receptionist at a dental office, but it paid barely above minimum wage. Even with that and the child support Dad's lawyer had arranged for us to get from his prison wages, which is basically nothing, we were going to struggle to make rent each month. She was looking for a second job, maybe waitressing on weekends. When we got home, I found Finn in our room, crying as he stared at his phone. Someone from our old school had messaged him, telling him that everyone knew his dad was a criminal and asking if he was one too. I took his phone away and blocked the kid, then sat with him while he cried himself to sleep. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about all those adventure days, how Dad would point out architectural details, teach us about the history of old buildings, show us how to move silently and leave no trace. I'd been so proud of those skills once. Now I realized he'd been grooming us, teaching us the family business without us even knowing it. Yesterday, Mom sat us down for another family meeting. She looked exhausted but determined. She told us that the CPS investigation was ongoing and that they were considering placing us in temporary foster care while they evaluated her fitness as a parent. The only way to prevent that was to show stability, financial, emotional, physical. I asked what we could do to help, and she just looked at me with this sad smile and said we'd already lost enough of our childhood because of their mistakes. She didn't want us to worry about adult problems anymore. But how could we not? Our entire life had been turned upside down. Then I woke up early and found Mom at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and her checkbook, crying silently. When she saw me, she quickly wiped her eyes and tried to smile. I sat down across from her and asked her to be honest with me. Had she known all along what Dad was doing? She put her head in her hands and was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Finally, she looked up and said, I knew something wasn't right. I chose not to look too closely because I was afraid of what I'd find. I was afraid of losing everything. And now we've lost it anyway. Dad's in prison. Our old life is gone. Mom's struggling to keep us afloat. Finn's fighting his own battle with what Dad taught him. And I'm stuck in the middle trying to figure out who I am when everything I thought I knew about my family has been exposed as a lie. Sometimes I miss the adventures. Sometimes I catch myself looking at buildings and wondering what's inside. Dad's voice is still in my head, pointing out entry points, identifying valuable items. I'm terrified that whatever made him the way he is might be in me too. Last update. It's been many years since my first post, and I never expected to be writing this update. I honestly thought I'd moved on from all of this. But some wounds never fully heal, I guess. Dad got released from prison 3 weeks ago, and everything I thought I'd resolved about our family's past has come flooding back. For those who need a refresher, when I was 15, I discovered that our family's adventure days exploring abandoned buildings were actually my dad's cover for breaking and entering theft. He went to prison for 5 years, we lost our house, and my mom, brother Finn, and I had to rebuild our lives from scratch. The last years hasn't been easy. We eventually moved out of that depressing apartment into a slightly less depressing townhouse when Mom got promoted at the dental office. I worked through high school and managed to get enough scholarships to attend community college, then transferred to State University, where I'm finishing my degree in psychology. Yeah, having a criminal father and a klepto brother definitely influenced that choice, LOL. Finn had a rough time through high school. He got caught shoplifting twice, which was terrifying given our family history. The second time, the store owner actually recognized our last name and made this comment about, like father, like son, that made me want to crawl into a hole and die. Mom got him into therapy, which helped somewhat, but there's still this weird gleam in his eyes sometimes when he spots something valuable that makes my stomach twist. Dad and I wrote letters occasionally while he was in prison, mostly surface-level stuff at first. How school was going, the weather, books I was reading. I never visited after that first year. It was too hard seeing him in that orange jumpsuit. Too confusing to reconcile the dad who taught me to ride a bike with the man who taught me to be an accomplice to burglary. When his release date got closer, Mom started talking about him moving back in with her and Finn. They never divorced, partly because Mom is religious, partly because she couldn't afford the legal fees. I'd moved into my own apartment by then, sharing with 2 roommates to split costs. When Mom told me about her plans, I kind of flipped out. Like, was she serious? After everything he'd done to us? We had this massive argument in her kitchen. I kept asking if she'd forgotten how he destroyed our lives, how we'd lost everything, how she'd had to work double shifts for years just to keep a roof over our heads. She got this look on her face I'd never seen before and said, William paid his debt to society. If God can forgive him, so can I. I stormed out, didn't talk to her for almost 2 weeks. Finn texted me saying I was being unfair, that Dad deserved a second chance. Easy for him to say. He was only 14 when everything happened, and he still idolized Dad in this weird way. I was 15, old enough to understand exactly how Dad had betrayed us, how he'd trained us to be criminals without our knowledge. The day before Dad's release, Mom called and asked me to come to dinner the following weekend to welcome him home. I told her I needed more time. She started crying, saying she needed me there, that she couldn't handle it alone. Classic mom guilt trip. I finally agreed, but only for her sake. I spent the whole week dreading it. What would I even say to him? Hey Dad, welcome back. How was prison? Thanks for ruining my childhood and giving me trust issues that have sabotaged every relationship I've tried to have. When Sunday came, I drove to Mom's place with this knot in my stomach. I sat in the car for like 20 minutes, almost turned around twice. Finally, I forced myself to go in. Dad looked older, gray hair, thinner face, but still recognizably the man who'd wake us up with Adventure Day. He stood up when I came in, awkward, like he wasn't sure if he should hug me. I kept my distance, giving a stiff wave instead. Dinner was excruciating. Mom kept trying to fill silences with cheerful chatter about neighbors and church friends. Finn was surprisingly quiet. Dad asked me about school, and I gave these short, clipped answers. I could feel Mom's eyes on me, silently begging me to try harder. After dinner, Mom insisted Finn help her with dishes, not so subtly giving me and Dad time to talk. We sat in the living room, avoiding eye contact. Finally, Dad cleared his throat and said he knew I was angry, that he didn't expect forgiveness, but he hoped someday we could at least be cordial. I was planning to just nod and leave as soon as possible, but something in me snapped. I asked him if he had any idea what he'd done to us, not just the financial stuff and losing our home, but how he'd twisted our sense of right and wrong, how I still sometimes have nightmares about breaking into houses, how every time I see an abandoned building, I hear his voice pointing out entry points, how I double-check myself constantly, afraid I've inherited whatever made him think stealing was okay. He sat there taking it all in, his face getting more pained with each word. When I finally ran out of steam, he looked down at his hands and said something I wasn't expecting. He told me that in prison, he'd had a lot of time to think about why he did what he did, that his own father had been dirt poor, always scraping by, and he'd grown up feeling like the world owed him something. When he lost his job, all those old feelings came rushing back. The desperation, the resentment toward people who had more than him. But the adventures, those were real, he insisted. He really did love exploring those old buildings with us, teaching us about architecture and history. It wasn't all a cover for his crimes. He just compartmentalized, told himself that what we did as a family was separate from what he did alone. I didn't know what to say to that. The next morning, I woke up to a text from an unknown number. It was Dad asking if we could meet for coffee. Mom had given him my number. I was annoyed at first, but decided it might be better to talk somewhere neutral, away from Mom's hopeful eyes and Finn's hero worship. We met at this little coffee shop near campus. Dad was already there when I arrived, nervously fiddling with a napkin. He'd brought a small, worn notebook with him. When I sat down, he pushed it across the table, explaining that it was a list he'd made in prison. Every place he could remember breaking into, everything he'd taken. He'd already given it to his parole officer as part of making amends. I stared at the notebook, not touching it. The idea of seeing all his crimes listed out made me feel physically ill. Instead, I asked him why he was showing me this. He said he wanted me to know he was done hiding things, done compartmentalizing. That transparency was part of his recovery. Recovery. Like he had a disease. Maybe he did. I asked if he really thought he could just list everything out and be forgiven. He shook his head, saying he didn't expect forgiveness, especially not from the victims. He just wanted to be honest with me. I finally opened the notebook. There were so many entries, spanning years, places I recognized from our adventures, and many more I didn't. Next to each entry were dates and items taken. Some had additional notes. Family heirloom, irreplaceable, or later learned owner had recently died. Children devastated by loss of mementos. He'd been researching the impact of his thefts, learning about the people he'd stolen from. It was both better and worse than I'd imagined. I closed the notebook and slid it back to him, asked if Mom and Finn had seen it. He said no, that he wanted to show me first because I was the one who'd called him out from the beginning, the one who'd recognized the truth when Maria's police officer dad explained it. We talked for nearly 3 hours, about his time in prison, my college experiences, Finn's struggles. At one point, I asked if he ever missed it, the thrill of breaking in, finding valuable things. He got very quiet, then admitted yes, sometimes he did, that it was something he'd always have to guard against, like an addiction. That scared me more than anything, the idea that he might relapse, might drag Mom and Finn back into that life. When I expressed this fear, he promised he was committed to staying straight, that his parole included therapy and regular check-ins. But promises from Dad didn't mean much to me anymore. The next family dinner was less awkward but still tense. Dad had found a job at a warehouse, the only place that would hire someone with his record. Mom seemed happier, though tired from still working long hours. Finn was excited about starting community college in the fall. As we were finishing dessert, Dad started talking about this historical building downtown that was being renovated, describing the architectural details with that old, familiar enthusiasm. I watched Finn's eyes light up, that same excitement I remembered from our childhood adventures. Without thinking, I cut Dad off mid-sentence, asking if he'd told his parole officer about his interest in this building. The table went silent. Mom looked mortified. Dad's face fell as he realized what I was implying. He quietly said he was just appreciating the architecture, that he had no intention of going anywhere near the building. Finn accused me of not giving Dad a chance, of always assuming the worst. Mom tried to change the subject. I couldn't back down. I told them about how real people were still suffering because of what Dad had done. Finn got defensive, saying Dad had served his time, that he deserved a fresh start. Mom looked torn between agreeing with me and wanting to support Dad. Dad just sat there, taking it all in. Finally, he raised his hand to stop the arguing. He looked at me and said, "You're right to be cautious. I haven't earned your trust back yet." Then he turned to Finn and said something that shocked me. "I need you to understand that what I did was wrong. Not just illegal, morally wrong. I hurt people. I violated their homes and took things that mattered to them. I don't want that for you." It was the first time I'd heard him fully acknowledge the wrongness of his actions without any qualifiers or excuses. Finn looked confused, like this contradicted everything Dad had taught him. Mom had tears in her eyes. Before I left that night, Dad asked to speak with me privately on the porch. He asked for my help with Finn, said he was worried Finn had romanticized his crimes, that he needed to understand the consequences. I was torn. On one hand, I was still angry with Dad, still didn't fully trust him. On the other, I was worried about Finn, too. I agreed to help, but made it clear I was doing it for Finn, not for him. Over the next few weeks, a tentative new normal emerged. Dad attended his therapy and parole meetings. Mom seemed less stressed now that there was a second income. Then came Dad's first parole violation. It wasn't a burglary. He missed a check-in meeting because he'd gone to look at an abandoned factory outside of town. He wasn't breaking in, just looking, but he'd crossed county lines without permission and missed his appointment. His parole officer gave him a warning, but it sent Mom into a panic and confirmed all my worst fears. When I confronted him about it, he got defensive, saying he wasn't doing anything wrong, just looking at the building from the outside. I asked if that's how it started before, just looking, and he didn't have an answer. That night, I had a long talk with Mom. I told her she needed to be realistic about who Dad was, about the possibility that he might never fully change. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she admitted she'd been having similar thoughts, that she'd noticed Dad looking at buildings in that old, calculating way. For the first time, Mom and I were truly on the same page. She asked what I thought she should do, and I was honest. I didn't know. Leaving him would mean starting over again financially, which she couldn't afford. Staying meant potentially enabling him if he slipped back into old habits. We didn't come to any conclusions that night, but something had shifted. Mom was seeing Dad more clearly, less through the lens of wishful thinking. 2 days ago, Dad called me asking to meet. I suggested a park this time, somewhere public but where we could talk privately. When I arrived, he was sitting on a bench, that notebook in his hands again. He started by apologizing for the parole violation, for making Mom worry, for confirming my suspicions. Then he handed me the notebook. Not the list of thefts this time, but new pages he'd written, a plan for moving forward. I read through it all, not sure what to feel. I was impressed by his self-awareness, his concrete steps toward change, but wondered if this was just another performance, another way of hiding his true intentions. He said he knew it would take more than words to earn back trust, but he was willing to do the work, not just for Mom and Finn, but for himself, and for me, if I was willing to give him that chance. I told him I needed time to think, that I couldn't just forget the past 10 years, the damage his choices had caused, but I also couldn't deny that he seemed to be trying in a way he hadn't before. As I was leaving, he called after me, asked if I remembered how I used to love finding little architectural details on our adventures, gargoyles on old churches, hidden carvings in woodwork. Said that part was real, that my appreciation for those things didn't have to be tainted by what came after. It's not a neat, happy ending. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if Dad will stay on the right path or if the pull of his old life will prove too strong. I don't know if Mom will find the strength to hold him accountable or if she'll keep making excuses.